Okay, so Neal, thank you for being here. How are you?
I'm great. It's always a pleasure to get to nice places.
Excellent, excellent. So, for most of us that have been here for a while, we know who you are. You don't need introduction, but our audiences change from time to time, and we have new people coming. So tell us who you are and what you've been doing over these past years.
Well, for the past 8 years, since I left Dan, I've gone back to Canada. I was at Duke and Dan doing the diving research, and I was recruited to Université Laval to take on what was then the first chair in North America, a research chair in diving hyperbaric medicine. And so it was just too good to pass up, the opportunity to develop a program of research that hadn't been done before.
Of course. So you started saying, well, over the past few years. So you've been at Dan since when?
That is a good question. I think my first appointment at Duke was in 1997.
Okay.
And I was part-time because I had appointments at different university, but I had an adjunct position. So I was doing research 1 day a week at Duke. And as soon as I started there, I got fairly involved with Dan, and then it became more and more involved. And there was a point when we were a little bit short on research money, and Dan was kind enough to chip in to cover the salary. Duke was very good at making sure that we balanced the clinical and the research dollars so people could be retained, which was great because you maintained a lot of expertise in the organization. But so when Dan stepped up and did that, I started doing more and more for Dan. And I think that was probably around 2003.
Okay. So 2003, and you moved back to Canada
At the end of 2016.
Okay, so about 13, lots of years. And so what would you say were the most interesting studies you did during your time at Dan? Because during your tenure at Dan and Dan Duke, Dan and Duke, they made significant contributions to safety.
They did. And I'll give credit to Dick Van for this. One of the things that happened with the Dan research that would be difficult for anyone else to do was longitudinal research, because Dick Van didn't have an ego to play with, and so he was happy to support good projects that went forward. So we literally worked on the flying after diving study for 20 years. We wrapped it after 20 years. And so when we started Duke, I started Duke in 97, and it was starting with NASA trials and flying after diving trials. But so that's probably the most important single thing that was done, because to fund a project for 20 years without a lot of intermediate return, it takes commitment. And that is something that was exceptional for Dan. So it's still, those are the data, the best data that exists right now in the world.
And actually, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because very few people know that those guidelines came from research done at Duke with Dan. So this is remarkable, and I think it's important for for new people to see, because many times people, the insurance product that we have, it has kind of taken over our identity, but that's not who we are. And so we've been doing this for so many years, and we're proud. I don't work for an insurance company. You didn't work for an insurance company, and this is what Dan is all about, right?
Yeah, the mission activity.
Exactly.
And if we stay on that flying after diving, we had a workshop in 2002, and there were a few very limited data that came from the 40s and a little bit, tiny bit from the 70s, but the vast majority of data was Dan data. And that is what generated the 2002 guidelines, which still stand today as the most commonly recognized standard.
Yeah, and that has been adopted worldwide not just by recreational diving, but navies around the world, right?
Largely. Where it was limited, we had really good data on the single no-D dive, no decompression dive, and we had good data on multiple days of diving or multiple dives per day. What we did not have good data on were decompression diving. Yeah. And so in those 2002 guidelines, we were very specific. We said that you needed a 12-hour surface interval after a single no decompression dive, an 18-hour surface interval after multi-days of diving or repetitive dives, because we found in our lab research that we were not giving anyone decompression sickness if they had more than a 17-hour surface interval. Right. But on the decompression side, we acknowledged we didn't know, so we said the service interval should be substantially longer than 18 hours.
Yeah, and you left that to interpretation of...
We did, and the funny part about that is I got more than once contact from someone who said, well, 18 hours and 15 minutes, is that substantially longer? Right. And I think everybody in the room in that workshop was thinking 24 hours. Right. But we didn't have the data to say that. But that's why the common rule is 24 hours.
Yeah. And I'm glad you say that, because on our, on the material we produce for lay people, we made an infographic, which is all pretty, and it's, of course, widely distributed. And we say 12, more than 18, and then we said 24, and we debated a lot about what to put there. But on an infographic, saying 18 or significantly more than 18, it was hard. So we said, okay, for lay people, this is probably safe, and it's the way to go.
And it is the most standard recommendation. And that's why you can't truly say that everyone has adopted the DAN guidelines. I think it is fair to say that most organizations have adopted the 24 hours as a recommendation.
That's right. So flying after diving guidelines, yes. What would be the next?
Well, the ongoing diving safety, again, the annual reports, the collection of those data and then reporting them is something that no one else has taken the time to do from that pool in North America. There are some smaller efforts that have been done in the UK and some in Australia, New Zealand, but the DAN data have been impressive in the breadth of capture. And I hesitate a bit because, to be honest, some people think the DAN data are perfect, and they are not.
Of course not.
Because there is not an investigative unit. The data that come in are often the data you live with. And so there is some hand-waving, and there's some interpretation and interpolation and extrapolation of the data. But they are the best of what we have. And I think as long as people appreciate the limitations, they're good data.
Exactly.
The important thing for me is that people have to be critical when they look at data and make sure that they stay within the bounds of that work. And if you stay within the bounds, the DAN data are quite impressive. When you look at the annual reports of decompression sickness rates, of fatality rates, they're not perfect, but the picture they provide is very good.
Right. Well, the same way when we do this, what we call this hotline-derived epidemiological studies, it's important to state what the limitations are, just to make sure that, people are not extrapolating beyond what is safe and sound, right?
Yep. And I think a lot of researchers have to do a better job with that. There's a feeling by some that if they admit to their limitations, their shortcomings, they won't get published. And now, I was a journal editor for a large number of years, and one of the things I looked for first was the limitation section. If an author didn't admit to limitations, I was very suspicious of their work. And so I think it's very important that we maintain an honest context for whatever we do. It doesn't make it weaker, it makes it actually better, because you know where the framing should begin and end.
Of course. Now, you mentioned you've been editor for journals, so tell us about that, because that's something that, when we were together working on that, that's something that I particularly enjoyed a lot, was that critical mind of yours in dissecting wording and making sure that you craft your message right. And I think this has been acknowledged by the industry, because again, you've been editor on a number of journals, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think that the precision in wording is absolutely critical. We, again, as humans, have a tendency to want to upsell or oversell a little bit so it sounds better, and that's not doing anybody a good service. I think if we're more precise, and again, we talk within our limits, we do a much better job of helping people understand, because no answer, we never find truth. When you talk about science, it's not about discovery of truth. Often it's trying to reduce the error in what we know. Finding the limits of what we know, where does it get noisy, where can we paint a picture that makes some sense? But yeah, I was on the editorial board of Wilderness Environmental Medicine, the journal, I'm still on the board, so I think it's been 20 years. But the position came open for the editor-in-chief, and I put my name in for it, and they actually hired someone else, but they offered me an associate editor position, which I did for a year, and then that person ended up leaving the position, and I took over and stayed for quite a while, and I truly enjoyed it. I like the work because I do like picking on the detail, as anybody who's given me a draft PowerPoint presentation can attest.
That's true. So Neal, tell us about yourself. How did you become a diver and eventually a researcher?
Well, I started in aquatics. So when I was very young, I started swimming. I think when I was 5 years old, I started taking swimming lessons and immediately gravitated to it. And so by the time I was 8, I joined a swim club and became a competitive swimmer. And I did that seriously for 6 years and then very non-seriously for another 3 years. But the water worked for me. And so when I was in high school and I was looking to the future, it was clear that water and diving had to have something to do with it. And I was drawn to the biology. So while I was in high school, I actually became certified as a scuba diver. And from there, it made it very obvious for me to go into zoology/marine science for a biology degree. And when I came out of that biology degree, I wasn't willing to work in a lab, which is what most people did with a bachelor's in zoology. So instead, I ended up working as many years to get ahead in the diving world. But it fit for me because I had the biology background and I was an instructor from the age of 15 in aquatics. And so it fit for me. I like the skill of diving. I like being able to bring in the biology and the teaching. And so it worked. So from there, I became the diving officer at the University of British Columbia. Mm-hmm. And while waiting for that position, I finished a master's degree, or I started a master's degree and then finished it when I got the position in diving physiology. And I worked as a diving officer for 5 years, and I looked around me, and there were a bunch of people. It was a permanent position. And I saw the people who'd been in that position for 15 or 20 years, and I said, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to die here. And so I was invited to coordinate the data collection on a Duke project in Florida. This was actually surface interval oxygen breathing. It was a study that was being funded by NOAA, and they wanted to reduce the time they had the ship idling because it was very expensive for ship time to wait for a diver to either decompress or to have a surface interval. So we used oxygen to accelerate the decompression procedure. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of neat, but operationally it was not so easy, so they didn't implement it. But I was able to turn that salary into a tuition waiver, and I started my doctorate. And when I left Vancouver to do the doctorate, I planned to be gone 3 to 5 years because Vancouver was the best place in the world to live. And all those Undersea and Hyperbaric Medical Society meetings I went to with Duke people, I was always impressed by their work, but the idea of living in North Carolina, my God, it's too hot. There are bugs. I can't believe it. But once I moved to the States, and then Dick Van brought me up to Duke after I finished my PhD, it was hard to leave because there were just so many neat and exciting projects. The flying after diving was a good example for Dan, but we also had a great deal of funding. We had about 15 years of stable funding from NASA to develop decompression protocols for astronauts. And that is just a way cool opportunity to be able to look at the pressure continuum from the diving side to the aerospace side. And so everybody I know who's been at Duke, who's ultimately left, they have a hard time believing they can leave. And then when they leave, they say, why didn't I leave earlier? Because it's a pressure cooker. It's a fantastic place to be. But when I was recruited to come up to Laval to take on the research chair, to me it seemed like the right idea. Let's go for a change, see how it works.
And you've been mentioning Dick Van a couple of times, and it's great to honor the man. He made such a huge impact in diving medicine research. So I was fortunate enough to share some years Dan with Dick and with you when you were there, and with Petar de Noble and Rick Dunford. So, and one of the studies that I always remember that I think it was spectacular, and I think in many ways ahead of its time, was PDE, Project Dive Exploration. So can you tell our audience what was that about and what was the impact?
Project Dive Exploration was an ambitious project at the time. The goal was to collect 1 million electronic dive records to begin to analyze the risk of decompression sickness, to really parse it out into little bits to try to see how ascent rate, bottom time, this depth, multi-level, how all those factors worked. So it was ambitious. And we didn't achieve the 1 million dives. It got to about 350, 375,000, and a little bit lower once you looked at the clean dives. Project Dive Exploration was successful because we did have some cases of decompression sickness, and that was the important thing. Mm-hmm. We needed cases of decompression sickness so we could look at a risk profile of those dives. But the problem with PDE, if you want to call it a problem, we had a lot of people who were very keen to support it, and they provided their data, but many of them were very conservative divers. Right. And so we had a lot of dives that didn't end up with bad outcomes. And while that's good for the diver, from a data point of view, it's actually not great. We once shifted gears and we worked on a project on acute mountain sickness. And this was, again, something with Dick Van. And the beauty of acute mountain sickness is your incidence rate is 50%. Right. 50-50 chance you get it. Man, it's easy to get a data set with 100 to 200 cases, you've got gold. With project dive exploration, we needed large numbers, and ultimately the community bought in, the manufacturers bought in, and they made their computer downloads compatible, which was good. But then I think soon after, they were starting to develop the potential to move beyond project dive exploration. And no one has taken it on, but that is coming, the ability to analyze those dive profiles.
So remind us, so PDE run from which year to which year?
Oh, goodness. I cannot tell you
I think,
exactly.
if I'm not mistaken, about 2005, 2006 or 7, that's when we started to wrap up. Because I remember at the time was part of.
And I don't know. We'd have to check the records. Yeah. My recall is it was a little bit later than that, but I cannot say for sure.
Yeah, it could be.
But that's the beauty. That's the beauty of the annual reports. Yeah. That this information was in the annual reports, and that information was something, again, no one else had to share.
So PDE ran probably between the mid-90s to mid-2000, 2007, 10 or so. So that's what I meant when I say that it was ahead of its time. Because when you think about it today, we all live with computers, dive computers that are connected via Bluetooth to a super powerful computer that is connected to the internet. Yep. So at the time, we needed to fill out those forms and scan them and send them via email. And still, despite technology not being there, it was remarkable how the community embraced that project and collaborated for a greater good. So that's...
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that project dive exploration actually spurred the manufacturers to enhance their own capability, because the DL7 format was to allow electronic downloads. And then it was a fairly cutting edge effort. Now, as you say, everyone is able to do it. But I think it was one of the first opportunities where, on a large scale, there was a goal to try to get all manufacturers. And to give Dick Van credit again, it was his personality and perseverance that got those manufacturers to say, yes, we'll support this. So he has done an awful lot for the community, and very quietly. He was a very humble fellow.
And that is, I think, the beauty of Dan, that we always see ourselves as the Switzerland. Only someone from Dan and only someone like Dick Van could have, bring computer manufacturers that were competitors at the time in an industry that was just starting to explode, and have them agree on, let's put this software, this algorithm, or this format in your computer to be able to analyze it easily. So that's remarkable. And again, it shows, the impact that Dan has had in the diving industry. One more thing I wanted to talk about with you, because I know you have strong arguments about this, is, in general, diving community, we understand that there are some risk factors that we can control. And one of those that I think has been widely known and distributed is the role of dehydration in the pathogenesis of decompression sickness. So I've heard you say a couple of times that you think that the role of dehydration could be a little bit overestimated. Is that true? Can you expand there?
No, it's not true. I'd say it's way overestimated in terms of its importance.
Okay.
There is a lot that has gone on in the diving industry. People talk about decompression sickness. The number one cause is dehydration. It makes a really good selling point on your boat. You can put a sign on water and say, drink, drink, drink. It's the number one cause of decompression sickness. It's not true. One of the reasons I think that myth came into being is when someone comes in very sick from decompression sickness, you get a fluid shift, and they can be determined to be dehydrated at that point. But that was probably a cause of the disease. It was caused by the disease. It was not the cause of the disease. And so there was a misunderstanding of dehydration. Dehydration is one of probably 24 risk factors. And it is not in the big three. The big three, number one is the dive profile. Number two is the exercise, the timing and the intensity. And number three, if you're not in thermoneutral, tropical, subtropical waters, it's the thermal status and the timing of that. Whether you're cool or warm on the way down, whether you're cool or warm on the way up. Those are the biggest things. Everything else, it's not quite noise, but they're small factors. They can work together to make an impact, but they by themselves are not really changing the narrative. And so dehydration, we want people to have sound hydration. That's good for health. But to hyperhydrate before a dive because you think that will protect you, that actually puts you at risk of immersion pulmonary edema. And so that's the problem, that people are almost always looking for the simple solution. I don't eat well, so I'll take a multivitamin. We want the quick fix. But hyperhydration is not the quick fix. People might think they are more resistant or more protected because they drink a lot. No, they're just more at risk of another condition, and it's not really helping them from a decompression point of view.
Right. Yeah, we see also this on the hotline when we get calls and, somebody to, listen, I'm here at the chamber and I have decompression sickness, and turns out I was dehydrated. Like you said, oftentimes dehydration is a consequence of decompression sickness and even a consequence of immersion, right? So rather than the cause for decompression sickness. So yes, I'm glad that you can help us bring that point down, because it's something that we hear often and often.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying just a little bit more on this. People do, as I said, they want to find something to blame and they look for a scapegoat. But if you ask anyone who will tell you they got bent because they were dehydrated, ask them, have you ever had a dive with a similar level of hydration before? And they'll often say, oh yeah, I was kind of diving normally. So why was dehydration suddenly the magical factor today? We really like looking for scapegoats because we don't like the unknown. And when I've been bent twice in research studies, and the first time I got decompression sickness, Dick Van gave me a set of fuzzy dice, the air fresheners you used to hang on your rear view mirror. And it was to remind me about the probabilistic nature of decompression sickness. Sometimes there's a luck of the draw component. You can think you're doing everything the same way, you get bent. You have to be comfortable living with a little bit of uncertainty in diving, because the reality is the underwater world is fairly unforgiving. We weren't designed to live there. So to be there, we have to take certain care, and we have to take certain risks. We have to make sure we're doing everything right, but we can't fool ourselves into thinking we've got a solution when we don't. And that is one of the biggest things I think we need to work on in education. Make sure that people truly appreciate the risk and a little bit of how they can manage that risk without making them hyper-focus on any one point.
So, Neal, where are you going in the future? What are the things that you're going to do next or you're doing now that you think are relevant for our audience?
Well, I'm going to change that question a little bit, and it's not necessarily what I'm doing next, but where is the community going to go? If you listen to some, we are on the brink of getting personalized decompression.
Interesting.
And that is not at all true. We are an incredibly long way from getting to the point where we have truly meaningful, personalized decompression planning. But we're moving in that direction, and we have a lot of work to go in terms of developing the sensors, making them robust to be worn by divers in a watery environment, and then collecting a massive amount of baseline data to begin to understand what changes in the numbers actually mean, and then integrating those data into algorithms that compare the impact of a bunch of different variables, and then finally we'll get to something that resembles personalized decompression.
So could we be at the verge of a PDE 2.0? Or something along
I think it's ongoing now. There are a number of units around the world that are doing some work, and they're all doing it with the goal of personalized decompression. And some groups are overselling it by saying we're almost there, or we have a system. And I don't believe we're anywhere close to a true system, but we are at the point that people are developing sensors, and we're going to get there eventually. This is another problem that requires a long-term effort. And so we need an ongoing commitment. And yes, there may be minor successes along the way, but we need people who are willing to dig in for the long term, because it will take that commitment to get us to the point where you can put a box on your body that will truly guide your practice on this dive right now to positively affect your outcome.
And we're probably going to have many more sensors available, but compatibilizing that with our knowledge of decompression physiology.
Absolutely.
We're probably going to be with the sensors before we actually have the physiology figured out.
Yeah. Well, and this I think is an important distinction. We actually have a really good understanding of the physiological elements.
Right.
What we don't have is quantification. And so I can tell you, I can list those 24 variables that affect your decompression risk, and they're probably somewhere missing, but we have a whole bunch. What we can't do is quantify the effect. Right. And so that's where the diver will remain for the foreseeable future, the most important part of this decision-making tool chest. We need divers who say, okay, I was working hard on this dive, therefore I was taking up more inert gas. I need to add more decompression time or add more safety stop time to make sure I'm okay. We need people thinking in real time because we don't have any computers that can understand the nuance. And so we understand the risk elements. We cannot quantify the risk of any particular behavior. And I know that's frustrating for people, but I call that job security. It's a good thing.
You know, oftentimes we get calls on the hotline and, you know, from technical divers, and of course they're savvy. And sometimes, you know, they try to find the culprit and they focus on minor risk factors or smaller risk factors, like, for example, the gradient factors. Do you think that has a meaningful impact in your decompression stress? Or do you think usually when someone gets bent, usually there are other factors much more important than what particular setting you have in your computer?
Well, I actually believe that gradient factors are quite important because remember the top three concerns, the top three factors in decompression stress. Number one, the dive profile. Two, the exercise, and three, the thermal status. Number one is the dive profile. Gradient factors are literally allowing you to reduce your limit from a 100% M value, which we know is not universally safe, to dial it back to 80%, 70%, 60% of that theoretical limit. And so that does make you safer. Some people will argue that it's not a perfect system physiologically. I am not concerned about that. It really makes very good practical sense. We trust what's on a computer screen. If I can adjust a conservative setting and instead of it allowing me to go to 85% of that M value limit, right, it's now guiding me to go no more than 70% of that limit, I've created a real buffer. And so that is important. On the other side, that's gradient factor high. Gradient factor low, when deep stops were thought to be the important magic in making divers safe, they thought if we stop really deep, we will avoid bubble formation, we'll make ourselves safer. The problem with that is they took a concept too far. If they stopped as deep as they were, yes, they weren't getting bubbles, but they would have never gotten bubbles there anyway. What they are doing is they're stopping deep enough that any undersaturated tissue is still taking on inert gas. And so the time they spend down here is actually meaning they need to spend more time up there to be safe, but the tables didn't do that. It was allowing them to accelerate their shallow decompression, and that's why it's now been shown with data that deep stops increase the risk. So that's an example where we went too far with GF low, but when we use gradient factors, they can help us quite a bit. They can hurt us if we use them badly, but I believe right now I believe they're the most important conservatism tool we have for decompression planning.
So Neal, you have a long history with DAN's CME. You were course director for a good number of years until you moved to Canada. So what has been your experience and why do you think this course is valuable? After so many years of running it, right? We've been running it since 1982, I think.
I think the education is critical. I'm biased towards education. I started teaching early and realized I would always do it. I love it. And I think it's very important. And in this field, we have a lot of people who are passionate divers. And when those passionate divers get in trouble, they go for clinical support. And a lot of the physicians don't have that much background. So we need to educate physicians so they know they're not trained in medical school on diving medicine. They have a lot of things to study. And if there's only one board exam that has any relevance to diving, you know they're not going to focus on studying diving medicine. Right. So we have a knowledge gap in the medical community. We have a passionate drive for people to get out there. And I think these courses are great because they at least allow those physicians who are interested in diving themselves to bridge the gap, to learn. And these are very important. And I also think it's important to maintain a high standard.
Yeah.
And Dan has really led for many years in that regard. There are a lot of continuing medical education programs that are vacation CME courses, where you go, you sign in, and you enjoy your day, and you sign in the next morning. And the programs were never run this way. When they were initially started by Peter Bennett and run by Cindy Easterling, they set the standard fairly clearly that you had to be there to get the credit, you had to participate. And I inherited that when Peter stepped back, and I was pleased to maintain the same standard because I don't believe we should be giving academic credit if people aren't there. And so we really tried to maintain a very high standard. And we had more than a few people who would come in saying, you know, I planned to sit in the first lecture and blow it all off. And I sat through all of them. They were so good. And that to me is the win. I think we can't ever fall into the trap of believing we have to pitch our material to the lowest common denominator. We have to accept that people are intelligent and they're engaged, and then give them the information that can help them understand. Sometimes it's a bit challenging. Their brains can hurt, but that's why we have afternoon divings. Okay. You do the course in the morning so they're awake, and then the afternoon, it's laboratory experience so they can put some of those things in practice, they can have quiet conversations, and it really pulls it together. We now do an all-day course, and so it's an 8-hour course, either 5 or 6 days long. That is a long period of time for people to stay engaged. These CME courses where it is 4 hours of lecture and then 2 afternoon dives is probably the perfect balance for both academic and personal experience. And so you are going to attract people who want the academic knowledge, and also you attract some people who are perhaps new divers on their own, and they want to dive with a group that makes them feel reassured that it's going to be done well. And that means you're catering to the people who are thoughtful to begin with. And I think Dan has been very good on in building on that.
Yeah, and I think consistently the reviews we have are the same, and you know, we keep up the same standards. I mean, you have to be here. This is not a vacation. We try to make it, and we do make it amenable. That's why we're here. But it's important to say that, you know, part of the formula we have for this course is we want to interact with people, right? And this is something we've been doing since Peter Bennett's days, which is, you know, faculty, we choose a place that is small enough that we can either take over the whole place and that we are not competing with the local restaurant downtown. So we want the course, the interest to be diving, the course itself, and each other. And during dinners and lunches and breakfasts, we're all nerding about diving and diving research and sciences. So people enjoy that. That's something that I've taken from you at your time and you took from Peter Bennett. So we continue to carry on the same principles. And that's something that I think it makes this course quite unique. And again, people appreciate that. So one of the things we always do in our CME, as you know, because we've been doing this for quite a while, is every time we choose a CME location, we try to make sure that, one, we know the location, we know the facility, we know what to expect in the resort and everything. We know the dive operation, that's key. But also we want to make sure that we choose locations that they have a established hyperbaric chamber just in case anything happens. And one of the things we do when we do the CME is, of course, we invite the local team and the doctors, the nurses, the techs. This is something that we think has a lot of value. How many times do you remember we have done this, that we invited them? Was there any time where we didn't, or we didn't get a good feedback from the chambers?
No, I think every time we've run these courses, we have tried to reach out to the hyperbaric chamber and made it available at no cost or very low cost to make it easy for them. Scheduling is often the biggest difficulty for them. It's hard to fit in extra things when you're at home because there's so many competing activities. But I think that in almost every case, we've had some representation from the local chambers, and it's been very positive.
Yeah, and we always support them with not only by, you know, waiving any fees to participate in the course, but we support them through one of our programs that, you know, we've been running for a number of years, which is our Decompression Chamber Assistance Network.
Yep.
Yeah, so we've had this time Dr. Melville and his team join us, just as we did many times, and we've been doing every time we're here, we're always inviting them.
And I think it is the right thing to do because we are a small community and we need the chambers, the hyperbaric chambers available to treat divers. But it's important to remember that when we're also doing our job well, there aren't that many accidents. And so the chambers aren't needed that often. And so you have to have a community that believes in being ready for the emergencies to ensure that it's available. One of the things that the community really should appreciate is that hyperbaric chambers are used for a lot more than treating divers. Interestingly enough, at Duke, where some would argue we were the center of the diving universe, at most, the patient load that was dive-related was only 4% of the patient load. And so you really have more in the bread and butter, the wound healing, following up on radiation therapy, diabetic foot, things, carbon monoxide poisoning. You have a lot of other clinical applications of hyperbaric oxygen that are important every week. And if the chamber is able to communicate that well to the medical community, it's easy to get appropriate referrals and to keep those chambers busy and ready for when diving emergencies come up.
Precisely. Yeah, we always say we don't want to hear from you on the hotline. We don't want you to see you at the chamber. But if you need it, that's why we try to support these chambers. We want to make sure that we don't need to fly you anywhere. We can treat you where you are. So Neal, say you have a friend that is not a diver, and he says, I want to become a diver. And so now he is certified. What would be the number one tip you would give them? What would be the, your pearl of wisdom that you would say, you need to pay attention to this as a diver?
Well, the most important thing new divers need to do is get into the water. And they need to get into the water with people who are both competent and conservative. And I'm not saying overly conservative that they only want you to be diving in a swimming pool. I'm talking about people who are knowledgeable enough that they can interpret our complex knowledge of diving and make sure that they're diving safely. Because when you come out of a training course, you've done a good job of learning the basic skills you need to dive, but there's a lot more that divers need to learn to be safe and effective independently. And that is actually one of the fun elements of diving. Diving can take you in any number of directions. You can do it for recreation, you can do it for science, you can do it for public safety diving, you can do it for commercial work. There are so many things, and the learning is the same way. You can learn about diving physiology, diving medicine, biology. There are so many things. So for me, the most important thing a diver should take away is the knowledge that they're competent to get started, and now what they need to do is find a way to keep learning in the diving community.
Yeah, so when I was a diving instructor, I used to tell my students when they got certified, this C card you have now, this is a license to keep on learning. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. That is how we should be thinking about it. The certification card, in most cases, doesn't have an expiry date, but divers should understand that they are going to be at their best and safest if they are constantly learning, constantly practicing, and constantly getting a little bit better and a little bit more experienced. It's that old saw that you can be certified for 20 years. That could mean you have 20 years of experience, or it could mean you have 1 year of experience 20 times.
Right.
A lot depends on how much effort you put into growing and evolving into that activity. And if you do choose to grow and evolve, it can be a lifelong endeavor. There are a large number of people who find a way to incorporate diving into their lives throughout, and that is fantastic. You can enjoy beautiful places like this. We're in St. Lucia now, and we've been here a number of times with dive medicine courses. The folks here at Anne-Chastanet are fantastic in supporting this program. Yeah. And they make it easy. The physicians come, they get to learn. They also can dive under controlled circumstances with a well-trained dive crew. It can't get any better for learning. But we need people to understand that you're right, this is a license to learn.
Fantastic. Neal, thank you again for being here this time. Thank you again for everything you do, and hopefully we'll keep this flowing.
It's always a pleasure, Matias.